All right, sorry for the delay, my friends. We're going from the phone with the team today because the computer has decided that some driver update is going to keep it from connecting. So we're going to really finish talking about the Magic Mountain today, talking about it with slightly broader strokes than we talked about Ulysses with. Something nice about the Magic Mountain, which makes it, I think, more pleasant to read. It's a little bit less detail oriented, a little bit less sausage like stuffed full, saturated with information and very modernist physical detailing as well as mental detailing. We have not only insight into the layout and geography of Dublin down to very particular places, Barney O'Kiernan's pub and the National Library, but also the things and the people within them, but also the things and the people within the minds of the characters that we had access to. Recall particularly chapter 3 with Stephen Daedalus and the ineluctable modality of sound and also of vision. And the fact that though he was walking along a very uniform sandy mountain strand, beach full of sand, that his mind, his thoughts were very much multifaceted. And that is called stream of consciousness and can be very difficult to follow. The Magic Mountain is not as difficult to follow. I think it goes very deep, philosophically, psychologically speaking, but it does not play as many tricks on the reader as James Joyce does. Recall some of the great writers and their negative opinions on Joyce that had, particularly Carl Jung. He says, the thing about your text is that it seems like you're not really inviting the reader in, that you're more, putting your intellect, your intelligence against the readers, pitting them against each other. And it's almost insulting to read Ulysses to some extent because it is so difficult to read. And especially when one is reading it for the first time, if a book is hard to read, it can be difficult to give it the leeway necessary to really see the value of it. I think the Magic Mountain was written to be a far more pleasant experience and also to showcase a more pleasant experience. Recall that Stephen is very similar to the archetype of the tortured poet or artist. Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man was the first book in which he was featured that came out prior to Ulysses. Note that he has trouble with substance abuse. He drinks to excess with his friends. He lets go of his money. This Thursday on which he was paid, this Balloon Day, he's already lost over half his money. That I don't know whether he's paid weekly or monthly, but I think it is closer to monthly. It might be bi-weekly, but probably monthly. He's not good with his money. He's not good with his time. He doesn't have the best of friends. They abandon him in Nighttown, where he gets into a scuffle with a soldier and almost arrested by the cops. And then he doesn't even end up sleeping at home that night because he has given the key to his home, the Martello Tower, to this usurper, Buck Mulligan, with his usurporious, I'm just making that word up, to his usurping friend, Haynes, the Englishman, who wants to collect Daedalus's sayings, put them into a book. Great Irish Sayings or something like that. He doesn't have the title in mind quite yet. In contrast, Hans Castorp seems very much not tortured. Even though we know that he encountered death as a young person and has had sort of a sad life, his mother dying, his father dying, his grandfather then taking him in and dying within 2 years. He's known sadness. But just out of university, similarly to Stephen, but very differently in that he has studied the practical professions. He does not want to be a writer who writes the uncreated conscience of his people, as Stephen Daedalus does. He wants to be an engineer, and he wants to be in fact, the book that he's reading that we've mentioned, on the train on the way to the Burkhoff, is ocean steamships. So he ostensibly is going to play a very practical role with his people. A practical role that will very soon, as the book starts in 1907, it culminates in 1914 at the beginning of World War I, that a world in which engineering knowledge, particularly regarding nautical knowledge, will be used to enhance naval warfare. He will be used to generate tools of war. And so he I mentioned sort of like the hippies from 1960 and in the 1960s and rejection of the Vietnam War sort of checks out of society. Now, there are differences. The war is not yet going on when he first enters the Berghof. He may not even have an inclination that a war could exist, but he, rather than taking on the difficult responsibility of leaving the Berghof after his 3-week vacation up there and returning to take on his apprenticeship with these engineers and taking his role in the world, he decides against it. Now, Stephen has not yet himself, he also has not yet taken his true place in the world, right? He's still working in jobs after college. It's like, you know, when you go to college and you have a major and you really want to work some white collar job, like be an accountant, be a teacher, or you want to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist or something like that, but you're still working jobs that are sort of hourly wage. Maybe you're working at the mall, maybe you're working as a server. You get these things as a career, of course, but they might not be the sorts of jobs that you do want to work as a career after you have a bachelor's. And so he is working as a teacher, but that's not his career job yet. That's not his vocation. That's not what he wants to live in order to do and accomplish with himself. So Stephen finds himself at something of an impasse. He doesn't know where he's going to live the next day. He doesn't know how he's going to get over, I don't want to say get over himself, but stop from stumbling over himself. He has tremendous talent, but he needs to keep his money in his pockets. He only had, though he's young and he seems like he has a lot of time, time trickles away, as we all know from the turning of an hourglass. It trickles on regardless of our will. Turn it, it continues to trickle. Time continues to pass regardless of our tricks. And so Stephen has an unclear path forward, but he wants to go forward. Hans Castorp, it is a little bit less clear whether he wants to move forward or not. He could leave the Berghof, and this is a point that I think I have not been strong on. Something you should keep in mind while you read this is that he's not really that sick. It's a big question mark about how sick Hans Castorp is. People around him, most of them, Ludovico Celebrity, very sick. Joachim eventually dies after leaving the Berghof against Director Behrens's will. At first does very well in the military, then starts to cough, then has to take some time off, and then eventually is sent back to the Berghof where he died. These are individuals who are, in fact, very sick. These are individuals whose freedom is limited by their physical maladies. Hans, you might ask yourself whether he loses or gains freedom by going to the Berghof. He, without the conventions of a traditional life down in the flatlands, with social obligations, familial obligations, professional obligations, time spent working every day, he is allowed to sort of just meander about. He lives a life without responsibility. He doesn't make his own food. He doesn't clean his own clothes. He doesn't set the schedule for his own day because of how the Berghof works. Like when I said that it's like a university, I think that's very true, right? There are dining halls at universities. There are dorms. There are many things that we try and make simple for you so that you can focus on what's most important, your studies and developing your skills. In fact, if you already live in an apartment and have to make a commute, you probably notice that your life has gotten a lot more complicated than when you were in the dorms, especially if you have to pay for laundry now. And the laundry, Hans Castorp's here, you have to get like quarters in order to put it into the laundry machine. I remember that was always a nightmare for me. I would have to go to the bank, get those $10 quarter rolls and know that I was going to use them. The lights are just turning off. Interesting. It's like our own seance in here. My goodness. But I like the mood light. Just don't let it become too low a mood so that one loses the tension of one's consciousness. So what I really want you to think about when you think about these two very modernist individuals at very similar ages, very similar points in their life, is that they are extremely similar, but there are major differences in the details with how they approach life. All right, let's see if I can say a little bit more. All right, So at the Berghof itself, Hans Castorp dines at Joachim's table. Remember that there are 7 tables. 7 is a very special number in this work. He stays 7 years here. His room is 3-4, room 34, 7, 3 plus 4, and very many more 7s. Come up. Hans first, there are 7 chapters as well. Hans first, here's the slamming door caused by Metempsychosis. Okay, so this part of his acclimation to the Berghof is learning how things are so different on this mountain from down in what the residents of the inhabitants of the Berghof call the flatlands. In fact, there's very good work on geometry. It's fictional, called Flatland, if you're ever interested in that. No connection. But remember that when he first shows up, he seems to have something like a fever. He feels a little up, as if he's just had 3 or 4 shots of espresso. And so he's a little heightened in his consciousness. And we see these bobsleds go down the mountain. We're told, oh, well, those are the dead bodies. They have to be bobsled down. And he laughs maniacally, sort of a crazy laugh. Joe came and he says, oh, but that's weird how cavalierly you say that you see these dead people and you just say, oh yeah, that's very de rigueur, that's very normal, right? That's an ordinary occurrence. So he is, a very ordinary or mediocre man. What does it mean to be ordinary? It means to be what? Normal within the context of one society, to inhabit or to embody the habits and customs of one's people in such a way as to be sort of unremarkable, right? But what happens when one puts an ordinary person from one society into a very different society? Do they stay ordinary? Do they become extraordinary? Say, many people who really love fantasy literature, I think, like to maintain the illusion in their mind that were they just to be put in a different world from the one in which they exist, they would then be the protagonist. They would then have the qualities necessary to be the great hero. A question you might ask such a person is, in what world do differing virtues bring one to the top from this one? And does one in fact have those? Does one say, does one have the will to succeed? Does one have the mental drive? Does one have the physical strength? Whatever it is that makes one strong within one's fantasy universe, wielding sword, shooting magic out of one's hands, or having some sort of noble lineage that one did not know about. But so Hans continues to be surprised. And the next thing he hears is a well-mannered individual. And this is something we've all had some experience of with this infernal Coke machine out here. I call it Coke machine being from Atlanta. But he hears this door slam behind him. He thinks it's so vulgar. Who is it that he sees behind him? This beautiful Russian woman from the good Russian table with the French name indicating that she is from the higher echelons of Russian society. The higher echelon Russians in the late 19th, early 20th century would largely speak French, like the high echelon Romans during Julius Caesar's time would often speak ancient Greek. Their often language is of the elite among people. In fact, even in our own English language in America, you'll notice that when you go to a fine, when you try and indulge in fine culinary cuisine, often the words are and foods are French, like filet mignon, chateaubriand. You have an hors d'oeuvre. These are all French expressions, and you may have some escargot, some snails. But escargot sounds much better. In any case, these are vestiges of that sort of idea in our own language, even, but not just with French, also with Latin. So often our more technical scientific sounding terms are Latinic or Greek. But so like say we have the sun and the moon, these are both very good Germanic words. Then we talk about solar and lunar phenomena. Those are good Latin words. In fact, phenomena itself is good Greek. Phenomenal. If I were a Swedish chef. There we go. All right, in any case, so Hans Castorp is trying to adjust to this new situation. And he finds that his everyday is a bit different from how it was in the flatlands. In fact, he receives something like 6 meals a day. He's allowed to drink Kolbach beer that he loves quite a bit in the morning. And so that really sets the tone for the day for him. It sort of muddles his head, puts him in a sleepy state of mind. And so you might think, if this is how he starts his day, and this is the habit that he is attempting to instill in himself, is he going to be mentally sharp over these 7 years? Is he going to be moving forward and accomplishing anything? Or is he going to be indulging and enjoying himself at this tuberculosis sanatorium? Now, keep in mind, there are people around him that cannot leave, who are very sick, who are restricted by their illnesses. But the big question we have with him is, how sick is he really? The imaging technology at the time, the x-rays that are taken of his lungs, are not crisp, high definition images. They're the sorts of images, and this can happen today, by the way, which is why sometimes people say get a second, get a third opinion if you feel like something's really wrong with you, and the first physician doesn't see something. So that things can be missed by the naked eye, even by experts. Any expert will tell you that. It's amazing that we see anything, not that we miss anything. And so the evidence suggests that Hans may be sick. He doesn't really feel very sick. His temperature is a little bit higher, but everybody's temperature starts to rise initially upon going to the Berghof because of the nature of its elevation and what it does with the various bacteria within one. Director Behrens gives a somewhat medical explanation of this at one point during the course of the text. But everybody's incipient illnesses are brought to a crisis when they come to the Berghof. So there are very few so-called healthy people that come there and appear purely healthy. So even somebody who doesn't necessarily have a chance of becoming tubercular and developing their tubercules, for which tuberculosis is named, could, out of a sense of caution by Behrens and a sense of not necessarily wanting to get on with one's life, one could easily find oneself staying at the Berghof and staying for some amount of time. There's also a slight capitalist element to this, and that one does, in fact, pay to stay at the Berghof. What's the need of kicking a paying customer out who seems to be getting what he wants from the place? And so what I wish to emphasize about Hans is that he is removing himself from the normal trajectory of a life. He is removing himself from the normal structures that surround one in a social life, and it is living a very distinct and different sort of way among the ill. Sort of like, but very different from a very beautiful movie called King of Hearts, where a mental asylum is set during World War I. In fact, Hitler is a character. He's a low-ranking individual at this time, he had not yet achieved the rank that he would. France is being attacked by Germany in a small town. The sanatorium, where the mentally disabled individuals are, get free, go out into the town, and there's a big question throughout the text is who's truly insane? The people fighting this massive war, or the people who are in the insane asylum? And in fact, the protagonist again chooses to go into the insane asylum, which may help you to think a little bit about the context of Hans Castorp and what it is he's doing. In any case, he is affected tremendously by his dark fear. He loves his cigarettes, though they don't quite taste right up here. They will eventually adjust as he will adjust. He meets Herr Suddenbrini. Something to note here is that occasionally students haven't had so much German. They think Suddenbrini's first name is Herr or something. Herr is how you say Mr. in German. So Herr means Mr. Suddenbrini. So keep that in mind. It's not Herr. It is an honorific, as it were. And Suddenbrini suggests. That's Herr Albing. Excuse me. Suddenbrini. There he is. His soon-to-be failing guide and mentor describes himself as malicious. That's kind of weird. But when you see the comments that he makes to NAFTA later on, perhaps that makes sense. But Suddenbrini is very intelligent and cunning individual who uses words in ways that most do not. And so when he calls himself something like malicious, you shouldn't think of him as simply mean-spirited or denigrating in his nature. In any case, what's most important here is Settembrini warning. And this perhaps will help us to see what the nature of the Berghof is, this liminal space, this place that's like a limbo in which, like the Christian idea of limbo, the Catholic idea of limbo, where one stays for some finite amount of time before one is allowed to make one's way up the mountain of purgatory and into celestial paradise, a place where time is simply wasted. In fact, you might say, what does it mean if, say, you go to college for 5 years and then you do not end up with a degree? Perhaps, I would be the sort of person that say you still get a lot out of that, but would college then have been somewhere along the way or more like a limbo? In any case, Settembrini's warning. I salute reason, Settembrini replied. This is part of his Renaissance Enlightenment nature, his non-religious nature, his philosophical nature. And I salute courage as well, by the way. What you say sounds good, and it would be difficult to find any truly cogent objection. It's very interesting. It's hard to argue against Hans Castorp, and yet there's something wrong about what he thinks. Because I, too, have seen some marvelous cases of acclimatization. There's Fräulein Kneifer. Fräulein is like Miss in German. Just last year, an Adelie Kneifer from a fine family, the daughter of a higher government official. She was here for about 1.5 years and became so splendidly accustomed to life up here that once she had been completely restored to health, and that does happen, people do get well up here, she refused to leave on any account. She fervently begged the director to be allowed to stay. She simply could not, would not return home. This was home to her. This was where she was happy. Why does Settembrini give this warning to Hans Castorp? Is it clear to him that Hans Castorp has the same stuff as this Adelie Kneifer, who spent 1.5 years at the Berghof, became happy at the Berghof, and then begged not to leave it, though it is a hospital. And the nature of a hospital ultimately is to be somewhere one goes to get better and then leaves. And if one stays, generally it's under conditions one would not wish, that morbid conditions, mortal conditions, as it were. So, moving forward a little bit. Conspicuously, by chapter 4, our hero purchases not only new blankets in the subchapter on necessary purpose, but also a thermometer. And the thermometer, what does it mean that he is buying a new sleeping bag? That he is buying a new thermometer? Thermometers that are left for 7 minutes in the mouths of these inhabitants. It seems to suggest that he is taking on the custom of these people, that he is becoming like these people, that he's preparing to be one of these people. It does not seem like he is only going to stay at the Berghof for the 3 weeks that he originally planned to. Then we learn about an early romantic interest with him, a young man named Sviatoslav Hippa, who shared a pencil with him, and later Hans will dream that he will share one with Mademoiselle Shosha. Mademoiselle is the same thing as Fräulein. It's basically the same thing as Miss, French, German, and English. I should pause for a moment to mention something about this ambiguous romantic interest that Hans Castorp has. Apparently, he remembers a remarkable young man who had an ethnic look to him. He looked like he was something like Eastern European. So there was something exotic about Sviatoslav Hippa to Hans Castorp. And he had noticed him, and for I think 1 year, maybe 1.5 years, never spoke to him, refused to speak to him, until one day he found himself without a pencil prior to an assignment. Now, there is a sort of superficial Freudian psychoanalytic way of looking at sharing a pencil. And then I think there's a more substantial, higher level way of looking at sharing a pencil. Obviously, a pencil is a cylindrical, long object which is used by people. It's very easy to see this as a phallic symbol. As, oh, well, if they share a pencil, that must mean there's some sort of like homosexual attraction shared between them. And this is possible. You should know Thomas Mann is known for having himself had a family, but himself being homosexual. And at the very least, one of his most famous protagonists from A Death in Venice himself had sort of homosexual pedophilic desires for a young boy. And so very possible. But I think there's a little bit more there. When you think about the nature of a pencil, there's a little bit more to it than simply its shape. What does one use a pencil to do? One uses a pencil to create and to define things. One draws with a pencil. One writes with a pencil. In fact, as a writer, it is the tool of one's craft, a pencil or something very like a pencil itself. And so to share the pencil for Hans Castorp to share the pencil with this man, I think it does still show a level of attraction between them, but not simply a phallic level one, but one in which their beings mesh in that they share the same instrument of creation together. I might sound like I'm making too much out of that, except for the fact that when Hans Castorp finally during Walpurgis Night gets the chance to talk to Madame Shosha during various games, during their Carnival festival, he's playing a game where one needs to draw, doesn't have a pencil, and he goes drunkenly to her and requests her pencil. When he thinks about her and represents her in his mind through his dreams, he represents her as this boy. There is an identity between the boy Shivaslav Hippa and Madame Shosha, which is very much illustrated by the fact that they both lend him a pencil. And you still say, this argument still doesn't seem very strong to me. And I say, okay. Well, in the same drunken night where Madame Shosha and Hans Castorp first speak, and he has given her pencil, she leaves and says, make sure that you give me back my pencil. But she leaves the public area and goes back to her room. Where would he have to give her pencil back to her then? In her room. And in fact, in the next chapters, after she has left, we find out that he actually has something from her room, a Polaroid of her, not a Polaroid, but an image of her insides that she kept in her room. He must have gone to her room, given her pencil back, taken this, and whatever else happens between such individuals after drinking, spending a night in the same room together on a festival occasion. So when I do make something of the pencil, that is because there is in fact an actual romantic sexual relation that does happen not only in Hans Castorp's dreams and imagination, but in fact happens during the course of the text. All right, I want to talk before moving forward a little bit on the nature of illness. We have some excellent quotes here, and then on the nature of time, because I think these are two of the bigger philosophical concepts in this text. And this is where Thomas Mann really shows us, I think, the depth of his intelligence. I think it's really easy to see the brilliance of James Joyce because of the difficulty of his text. But sometimes Thomas Mann, because he has such a pleasant narrator, has such a variety of characters, one doesn't necessarily know just how brilliant he is until one sees him wax philosophical. So here he features a conversation between Hans, our ordinary person, and Stephen Brady, who's something of a mouthpiece for Thomas Mann with some key differences. Hans. Because for someone who's ill, one wants to express a certain seriousness and deference, doesn't one? Illness has something more or less venerable. He suggests that one becomes a little bit holier or more honorable or more worthwhile when one becomes ill, as if people should treat one with a different sort of reverence or respect. Perhaps that's true. Suddenbrini takes the opposite tack. Illness is rather a debasement, indeed a painful debasement of humanity, injurious to the very concept itself, injurious to the concept of humanity. Illnesses. And although one may tend and nurse illness in the individual case, to honor it intellectually is an aberration. A human being who lives as an invalid, this is an old expression for somebody who is so sick that they can no longer work productively in society. A human being who lives as an invalid is only a body. And that is the most inhuman of debasements in most cases. He is no better than a cadaver. So our rationalist Settembrini suggests that sickness, illness, takes away what's noble in one's soul, that one can no longer focus on politics, philosophy, and art, and the things that move culture and the world forward, but one has to focus on what oneself, and not what's finest in oneself, but often what is most base, one's body. One has to tend to one's illness, thermometer in the mouth for 49 minutes a day, while lying on one's back during good productive hours. And so his suggestion is that being sick does not ennoble, but debases. And that's something I'd really like you to think about. Do you think that sickness makes one holier or more venerable, that there's something special about being sick, or that there is something denigrating, something that lessens your being, lessens your standing when you are sick? You can see why Hans would argue what he argues, right? Because insofar as every character in the Berghoff is sick, then, especially if they are choosing to stay in the Berghoff because they're not particularly sick, he might think of it as an uplifting experience, that he is freed from the bonds of society and from the bonds of even the structure of time and its relationship to society. Because he is sick, like Madame Shosha herself says, he has the freedom to really kind of do what he wants. But Settembrini's counter argument is, if you have the freedom to do just what you want without various institutions supporting you and moving you forward and shaping you into something, are you making yourself into something, or are you just degenerating while you waste time? And this is the question. In any case, there's a nice little Latin expression here that Settembrini uses about Hans Castorp, placet experiri, which means he likes to experience. Something you say about somebody who wants to experience everything and uses it as an argument for that which they do. I'm doing this because I'll try anything once, for example. All right, let's talk a little bit about time. Let's close with this. I have several big quotes up here. One about boredom, one about habit as well, one about the phenomenology of settling in. Hopefully these will be of great use to you. But this all comes from chapter 4, the crucial chapter in which it is determined whether Hans will stay or Hans will go. If he ends up staying, which he does, he'll stay for 7 years. If he goes, he can get back to his life. Ultimately, there's something odd about settling in somewhere new, about the perhaps laborious process of getting used to new surroundings and fitting in, a task we undertake almost for its own sake and with the definite intention of abandoning the place again as soon as it is accomplished, or shortly thereafter, and returning to our previous state. We insert that sort of thing into the mainstream of our lives as a kind of interruption or interlude for the purpose of recreation, which is to say, a refreshing, revitalizing exercise of the organism, because it was in immediate danger of overindulging itself in the uninterrupted monotony of daily life, languishing and growing indifferent. This is an argument that's sometimes made that this is an Aristotelian argument, in fact, for why society should have diversity in them, that when all things are the same, you have no harmony. You have just a single note. It's only when you have several different notes that you actually have a harmony, that it is the combination of diverse elements in a harmonious chord or measure in this case that makes for harmony, not a uniformity of them. In fact, some argue that this is the major problem with fascism, that fascism tries to make every individual into the same individual and thus loses the virtue of being in a political society in which the diverse abilities of those around you help to produce the conditions that make society worth living. There are tax attorneys, there are plumbers, there are electricians, there are politicians to deal with to good or bad. There are teachers, there are bankers. All of these people exist so that you can do what you want and you don't have to focus on that sort of thing. In any case, here, the suggestion is that life can just become such a straight, monotonous line. And so that we have to take little breaks in it. Some are longer, bigger than others, and that helps us to create more of a measure, more of a harmonious feeling of time rather than a monotonous existence. If you do find that your existence becomes monotonous, this is of course after finals, because there is a level of monotony in study, then I perhaps return to this quote and see if you can't sprinkle in some differing things to do and some differing uses of your time. In any case, boredom. What people call boredom is actually an abnormal compression of time caused by monotony. Uninterrupted uniformity can shrink large spaces of time until the heart falters, terrified to death. When one day is like every other, and all days are like one, perfect homogeneity would make the longest life seem very short, as if it had flown by in a twinkling. So I think of that when I think of the expression that does not yet hit me, but perhaps almost surely will hit me someday, which is, where did all the time go? I think of myself at the end of my teaching career, looking out at students who may be very similar or very different from you, depending on when it is and what happens in the interim, and thinking, it all just seemed to start yesterday, and now it is over. Something I would add to this quote is that, and I think I've said this before, I've certainly said it before, but I may have said it to you, is that days often pass slowly, years often pass quickly for people. So keep that in mind, particularly if you find yourself bored. Perhaps you need to break up the monotony a little bit. Habit. Habit arises when our sense of time falls asleep, or at least grows dull. And if the years of youth are experienced slowly, while the later years of life hurtle past at an ever-increasing speed, it must be habit that causes it. We know full well that the insertion of new habits or the changing of old ones is the only way to preserve life, to renew our sense of time, to rejuvenate, intensify, and this word is used to mean slow, and I'll just say slow, and to slow our experience of time, and thereby renew our sense of life itself. That is the reason for every change of scenery and air, or a trip to the shore, the experience of variety, of refreshing episodes. Is it the case that when you do something which is new and have to break up your habits and spend your time in different ways, that you perceive the motion of time differently? Does time move at a different pace when you are doing something new as opposed to doing something old? I've given you my example. As a race runner, a runner of races, it is always recommended by coaches that one run the race course at least once before running it a second time, because one runs, one starts to mentally map the space so that one can then think about how to run race a little bit faster, know where to cut this corner, cut that corner, where to start running faster, where one's going to have to run a little slower up some math hill or something like that. That a habit of looking at the race course, even after only running it once, helps one to compress the time it takes to run it. This is why good habits are useful. The first time you study, painful, takes tons of time. But if you continually do it, get in the habit of doing it, the 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, however much time you spend studying, a day start to pass much, much quicker, as it were. Perhaps this is very useful for building habits that are, for you, useful but painful to create in yourself. In any case, here is Thomas Mann on phenomenology. That means the subjective experience, basically, of settling in to a place. The first few days in a new place have a youthful swing to them, kind of sturdy, long stride that lasts for about 6 to 8 days. It's interesting, 6 to 8 days. He's got a number that he puts to it. Then, to the extent that we, quote unquote, settle in, the gradual shortening becomes noticeable. First few days at home after a change of scene are likewise experienced in a new, broad, more useful fashion. Anybody experience that when they went home to Thanksgiving this time? Was it a very short break? Are classes getting shorter at this time? One hopes. In any case, the first few days at home after a change of scene are likewise experienced in a new, broad, more useful fashion. Only a very few. For we are quicker to grow accustomed to the old rules than to their abrogation. To abrogate something is a legal term, or to nullify the force of law. In theology, it's a very big question. When a religious figure in a tradition says something that contradicts another religious figure, say you are Jewish, and Daniel contradicts Moses, is one of the laws going to be abrogated almost surely? These are sorts of questions that can come up. And in any case, that is really what I want to say about time. I have one thing more on this. Okay. One last quote on time. And now we have a new phenomenon. This is from chapter 5, and time starts to pass much faster because over 6 years pass over the final 3 chapters, something like 3 weeks exactly passed during the first 4. So that's strange. And yet the final 3 chapters are hundreds of pages. And now we have a new phenomenon about which the narrator would do well to express his own amazement, if only to prevent his readers from being all too amazed on their own. Fact is, the account of the first 3 weeks of Hans Castorp's stay with the people up here, 21 days at the height of summer, to which by all calculations it was supposed to have been limited, that's 7 times 3, has consumed quantities of space and time that correspond only too well to what the author himself expected. Indeed, half confessed the coverage of the next 3 weeks of the visit, however, will require about as many lines or words or even seconds as the first 3 weeks required pages, wires, hours, and working days. We can see it coming. We'll have those 3 weeks behind us and laid to rest in no time. I'll just continue to the next one on the same page. That may well cause amazement. Yet it is perfectly in order and corresponds to the laws of how stories are told. Apparently there's some connection between how stories are told and the passage of time within stories and the passage of time in our own lives. Corresponds to the laws of how stories are told and listened to because both good order and the laws of narrative require that our experience of time should seem long or short, should expand or shrink in the same way it does for the hero of our story. For young Hans Castorp, who quite unexpectedly has found himself impounded by fate. Sounds a little bit less free when it says he's impounded by fate. And there's something interesting being said about the nature of reading and voyeuristically experiencing the acts and thoughts of another individual, that however quickly or slowly time is passing for Hans Castorp is how quickly or slowly we as readers perceive time as passing while we read. Almost as if what the act of reading is allowing the consciousness of an author as articulated through his narrative, plot, and characters becomes the guide for our own consciousness. That as you follow the words, which are themselves indications of the thoughts and feelings of our writer, that you absorb their thoughts and feelings, and that you feel as they felt, and particularly that you feel as they would have their characters feel as well. This is, I think, a majestic thing that art can do, and particularly art that uses the written word, that it can affect your consciousness so deeply that it changes your perception of time while you are experiencing it. And since we are getting to the end of things, I can only say to you that I hope your experience of time has sped up during the course of this class and course, and have not slowed down too much, except for when you really need it to focus. In any case, that's all I have to say to you today. I hope that you do very well on your final edits.